Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. What happens when everything you thought you wanted, wealth, success, suddenly feels empty? What if true happiness is found in the simplest of moments? James, a young billionaire, never imagined his life would be turned upside down by Diep, a woman living a humble, peaceful life. But when she suddenly disappears after a tragic accident, James must search for her in the mountains. Will he find her before it's too late? And what will he learn along the way? Stay with us as James embarks on a dangerous journey to find Diep and discover a new path for himself. Don't forget to subscribe and help us reach 1,000 followers. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the forest floor. The scent of damp earth mingled with the crispness of the afternoon air, while the rhythmic sound of an axe meeting wood filled the silence. James paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow, his hands rough and unfamiliar with the task. Next to him, Diep moved with quiet grace, her axe strike sharp and confident. Each swing was deliberate, her motions flowing with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime working the land. James couldn't help but watch her for a moment. The way her hair framed her face, the strength in her steady hands, it was all so natural, so effortless. She belonged here in this simple, grounding world. It was a stark contrast to the life he led, one of meetings, decisions, and constant motion. Yet today, as he stood beside her, he felt a strange longing for this quiet existence. "Are you tired?" Diep asked, her voice soft but steady, breaking his thoughts. James shook his head, offering a tired smile. "I think I'm doing okay," he said, though the ache in his muscles betrayed him. "Just not used to this." She nodded, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "It's good for clearing your mind. Sometimes we forget the small things when we're always chasing." Her words lingered in the air, and James found himself at a loss. Chasing. That was his life. But here, in this moment, amidst the sound of wood splitting and the quiet hum of the forest, something inside him stirred. It wasn't about finishing the task. It was the stillness, the peace he hadn't realized he'd been craving. The work had been steady, the day passing quietly, until the ground beneath their feet betrayed them. Diep, in a swift, fluid movement, lost her footing as she stepped too close to the edge of the ravine. The air seemed to still for a brief moment before her body was swallowed by the earth. James's heart leapt into his throat as he heard her scream, a sound that was swallowed by the trees, leaving only the rush of his own blood pounding in his ears. Panic gripped him instantly. His body moved before his mind, stumbling through the underbrush as he searched desperately. "Diep!" he called, his voice rough with fear. The forest, once serene and peaceful, now seemed like an unforgiving maze. "Diep!" he shouted again, louder this time, his chest tightening with dread. His eyes darted from side to side, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, through the trees, he saw her, crumpled on the ground, her body twisted unnaturally, a cry of pain escaping her lips. The sight of her in such a vulnerable state sent a cold shiver down James's spine. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he could do nothing but stare. A rustle of movement brought him back to the present. Officer Ly appeared from behind the trees, his presence a stark contrast to the frantic chaos of the moment. "I'll help you get her out," Officer Ly said, his tone calm, professional. His words, though steady, barely reached James, whose mind was racing. His hands shook as he knelt beside Diep, checking her for injuries, his voice trembling. "Diep, can you hear me? Stay with me." The sterile scent of the hospital was a sharp contrast to the natural, earthy aroma of the forest. Diep lay unconscious on the examination table, her body bruised but stable. James sat in the waiting room, his hands trembling as he tried to still his racing thoughts. The rush of adrenaline had worn off, leaving only a dull ache in his chest, a knot that tightened with every passing minute. He ran his fingers through his hair, looking at the clock on the wall, watching the seconds tick by like they had all the time in the world. But inside, it felt like time was slipping through his fingers. He had never known a moment of such pure vulnerability. The weight of his feelings for Diep was undeniable now, though he had tried so hard to bury it beneath layers of work, wealth, and ambition. What was it about her that unsettled him so? The rawness of her life, the simplicity she carried with such strength, had shaken something deep within him. He had spent years chasing after success, never stopping to question what he was chasing. But now, in the stillness of the hospital, as he waited for news, he wondered if he had missed something fundamental. His thoughts drifted back to their time in the forest. Diep's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes, it's easy to forget the simple things when you're chasing after too much. Her words cut through the clutter of his life, leaving him with a sense of peace he hadn't known he'd been craving. For the first time, James wasn't sure if more was always better. Maybe, just maybe, happiness lay somewhere else, in something simpler. He stood up abruptly, his decision made. When Diep woke up, he would be there, no longer just the businessman, but someone who had begun to understand the quiet beauty of a life lived without constant pursuit. Diep's recovery was slower than either of them had hoped, but each day brought a small improvement. When she was well enough to leave the hospital, James insisted on taking her back to the small cottage where she lived, a place where the air felt cleaner, where time moved at its own pace, far removed from the frantic energy of the city. The quiet that greeted them was unfamiliar to James, and yet it felt strangely comforting, like stepping into a world that had been forgotten, waiting for him to notice it. Diep moved through her days with a calm precision, organizing her small home, tending to the firewood, and preparing simple meals. She seemed to find satisfaction in every small task, things James had once dismissed as mundane. He couldn't understand it at first, the sense of peace she found in something as ordinary as chopping wood or tending to the garden. But as he spent more time with her, he began to see the beauty in her world. The rhythm of her work, the stillness that enveloped them was a kind of sanctuary. "Don't you ever get tired?" James asked one afternoon, watching her bend to gather vegetables from the garden. His voice was filled with genuine curiosity, mixed with something else, something like admiration. Diep paused, wiping the sweat from her forehead, and gave him a small, knowing smile. "Tired? Maybe. But it's different here. It's peaceful. It's enough." James didn't respond right away. He couldn't quite explain why her words resonated so deeply within him. All his life, he had believed in the need for more. More success, more wealth, more accomplishments. But now, as he sat in the quiet of the cottage, listening to the soft rustle of the leaves outside, he wondered if he had missed something important. He watched Diep work, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his own desires start to lift. Here, in this simplicity, there was a freedom he hadn't known existed. The evening air was cool and fragrant with the scent of herbs, the sky gradually fading to hues of purple and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The candlelight flickered gently between James and Diep as they sat at the small wooden table, the simple meal they shared filling the room with warmth. The day had been quiet, but there was a tension in the air that James couldn't ignore. Diep, sensing the weight on his mind, looked up from her meal, her gaze soft yet knowing. "James, what's troubling you?" she asked, her voice carrying a quiet concern. He paused, his fingers tracing the rim of his bowl. "I've been thinking about happiness," he said slowly, almost uncertain. Diep's expression softened, and she waited patiently for him to continue. "I've spent my life chasing things. Success, wealth, more deals. But now that I have all of that, I don't feel fulfilled," James confessed, his voice low and vulnerable. "I thought happiness would come with more, but now I'm not sure it works like that." Diep put down her bowl and met his gaze. "Happiness isn't something you can chase, James. It's in the moments you live, in finding peace with what you already have." James leaned back in his chair, contemplating her words. "But how do you know when enough is enough?" She smiled gently, her eyes warm. "When you stop needing more to feel complete. When you're content with who you are and what you have, that's when you know." Her words settled around him like the evening fog creeping in. James wasn't sure when it happened, but in that quiet moment he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The night had fallen, and the cottage was enveloped in a tranquil stillness. Outside, the world seemed far away, with only the distant sounds of nature to break the silence. Inside, the air felt thick with the unspoken emotions that had been building between James and Diep. After their conversation about happiness, James found himself more aware than ever of how much this simple life had changed him. Diep stood by the window, her hands lightly brushing the edge of the worn curtain. The soft glow of the moon cast a gentle light on her face, and James watched her for a long moment, noticing how the subtle peace of the night seemed to cling to her. She turned, sensing his gaze, and their eyes met. There was no need for words. In the silence, their connection spoke louder than anything they could say. "I've been thinking," Diep began, her voice quiet but steady, "about the kind of life I want. It's simple, really. A small house, a garden, chickens, maybe a dog, and you." She smiled softly, her gaze filled with a quiet longing. "Just a simple life, where we can grow old together." James's heart twisted at the weight of her words. He had spent so many years chasing after success, never stopping to think about what he truly wanted. But now, hearing Diep speak of this peaceful life, he found himself wanting it too. He had always thought happiness came with more accomplishments, more power. But now he saw that it was in simplicity, in moments like this. He stepped closer to her, his voice barely a whisper. "Diep, I never thought I'd find peace in a life like this, but with you, I think it's everything I need." The morning had come too quickly, a soft light filtering through the windows of the cottage, casting a gentle glow on the quiet room. James stood by the door, his coat draped over his arm, his heart heavy with an unfamiliar feeling. Diep stood near the table, her back to him as she folded a small bundle of clothes. The silence between them was thick, filled with words that were yet to be spoken. "James," Diep said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. "Are you sure you have to leave today?" James hesitated, his fingers brushing the door frame, not quite ready to step outside. The thought of returning to his old life, to the noise and chaos of the world he had known, suddenly felt foreign, almost suffocating. He had come here to find answers, to escape for a while, but in the days spent with a Diep, he had found something far more valuable. A glimpse of the life he had been missing. "I don't want to leave," he admitted, his voice quiet, "but there are things I need to take care of." He looked at her, his gaze steady but filled with emotion. "I've been running after the wrong things, Diep, and I think I need to figure out how to live a life that matters." Diep smiled, a soft, knowing smile that reached her eyes. "You've already started, James. The fact that you're here, that you've opened your heart, that's all that matters." James felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. He took a step closer, reaching for her hand, holding it for a moment before he spoke again. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. I want to be a part of it, with you." Diep's gaze softened, and for the first time, she looked at him with a mix of hope and understanding. "Then take what you've learned here, James. Let it guide you, and when you're ready, come back." As he stepped out into the crisp morning air, James felt something inside him shift. He didn't have all the answers, but he had found something far more important, a sense of peace, a desire to live differently, and a promise to return when the time was right. With every step he took, he knew this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where simplicity and love would guide him forward.
James, một tỷ phú trẻ luôn sống trong sự theo đuổi của thành công và giàu có, nhưng khi anh gặp Diep, một người phụ nữ sống trong cuộc đời giản dị, mọi thứ bắt đầu thay đổi. Diep đang mang đến cho James một cái nhìn khác về hạnh phúc, nơi không phải là vật chất mà là những khoảnh khắc đơn giản mà bình yên. Tuy nhiên, khi Diep gặp tai nạn rơi xuống chân núi, James cùng cảnh sát Ly bắt đầu hành trình tìm kiếm cô, và suốt trong những hành trình, James nhận ra rằng cuộc sống thật không phải chạy theo tham vọng, mà là biết trân trọng những điều đơn giản và yêu thương thực sự.